So now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome today's first speaker, Chris Jackson, Senior Vice President with Ipsos's political polling team. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our January Inside Track, kicking off our 2024 election coverage. I am joined by Sarah Feldman, our senior data journalist, and as always, we have a lot of data to go through with you today. As Ellen said, please don't hesitate to use the Q&A feature to log any questions you may have throughout the presentation. Sarah and I will definitely hold some time at the end to answer as many as we can. If we can't get to your question, we'll send you an email with a follow-up response after the webinar. Likewise, as Ellen said, this webinar will be made available on the Ipsos website in a day or two. This data, all the data this is based on, is also publicly available. You're welcome to use it, to cite it. It's all things that Ipsos has published. So with that, let's go into the itinerary. We have sort of our usual flow of show today, where I will start us off talking about the main issues facing the country. I'll pass it over to Sarah to talk about the economy, which continues to be the #1 issue, and sort of the more broad issue landscape. There are a number of things, of course, going on. And then finally, I'll conclude talking about the 2024 election and our latest public opinion polling on what we're seeing, not yet including some polling that we have done after the New Hampshire primary yesterday that will be forthcoming soon. So let's start off looking at the main issue landscape. As you know, we like to focus on the main issue as a way to set the context for how America is feeling at the moment, sort of what America's concerned about, what the worries are. This is actually November data that is from our core political tracking. We'll be actually updating this next week, though we anticipate it to looking relatively similar. Sarah, the slide deck keeps sort of skipping around. At the moment, we are seeing the economy as the #1 issue, continuing to be the #1 issue, though that is declining as I think we see the American public feeling a little bit less of a pinch by inflation and cost of living. As a consequence, we're seeing some other issues increasing in importance. And I think that's going to be something that we're likely to see for the rest of this year. The economy is going to continue to be the #1 issue, but it's probably going to have a smaller and smaller margin. And we're going to see a lot of other issues competing with it as sort of a top tier issue. And I think we're going to see a very complicated landscape with lots of things vying with each other to claim the American public's attention at any given moment in time. And depending on which one of those issues is the dominant issue as we head into November of 2024 is probably going to play a very big part on what happens on election day, who ends up winning. And we'll actually get to that in a little bit more detail when we get into our election section. But like I said, economy continues to be the #1 issue. Right after that, immigration and crime sort of in the second tier, and then a number of issues sort of in this third tier, with about 1 in 8 to 1 in 20 Americans saying it's one of their top priorities, ranging from the environment to terrorism, with things in between. And I think it's worth noting that even issues that have been very important electorally, like abortion, can actually end up appearing to be a relatively small percentage, 3% saying that it's their #1 issue. And yet abortion has been sort of the major issue for Democrats the last couple of election cycles, has helped them win a number of elections since the overturn of the Roe v. Wade decision by the Supreme Court. Next slide. This next slide is from our Consumer Trackers Care-O-Meter. This is a survey that we're running every few weeks where we ask Americans, do they know about an event and do they care? Does it impact them? And what we see is essentially over the holiday, most Americans didn't really know what was happening out in the world. And this is something we actually see pretty frequently over the holiday period. Americans don't follow the news quite as closely. Events don't break through the same way. And indeed, we only see sort of Maine and Colorado breaking through as a major event that the public knows about. But there are a number of other events, particularly foreign policy related, also some national political related, that Americans believe are important, even though they don't didn't know about it so much. And then things that are a little bit more pop culture related, falling in that don't know nor care bucket. But this is, again, something that our marketing team is doing every few weeks and that we're publishing, and that is a really good sort of pulse on what is driving America's attention at any moment in time. Now, as we move forward, I'm going to pass it over to Sarah to talk about the economy. There's a lot of interesting conflicting signals in the economy, but this is, as I said, the number one issue facing America right now. So lots of important information to share here. Sarah, over to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we're going to kick off the economy section with our consumer confidence tracker dating back to 2002. And what I really want to draw your attention to with this slide is the consumer confidence number from the past year or so. Consumer confidence has remained remarkably stable even as we've seen inflation and job loss come down. So, the economy is in a pretty good position if we look at the macroeconomic numbers, but we're not seeing that really reflected in the consumer confidence data. And, that is a trend when it comes to people's relationship to the economy and consumer confidence data writ large. Public perception of the economy tends to be a lagging indicator relative to these macroeconomic forces and factors. So despite good, rosy, GDP, inflation, job loss numbers, we're not really seeing Americans feel that because they're still, potentially reacting to some of the news from earlier this year. And I think this next slide really encapsulates this well. So here, if we look at consumer confidence across key metrics, job security, investing in future, purchasing confidence, and compare January 2023 to this year, we see a modest uptick in confidence. Certainly nothing huge, nothing major, not majority feeling confidence on any of these single measures. But, the context here is important. In January of 2023, inflation was roughly 6% and change. And in this year, this month, inflation is about half of that, sitting at about 3% and change. So even with inflation being cut by half, we're really not seeing that come through in this consumer confidence data, reinforcing the point that, consumer confidence, the public's relationship to the economy really lags relative to these other macroeconomic indicators. Another important thing to keep in mind as we think through the economy and some important points to note for the election, people's relationship to the economy isn't always cut and dry based on these raw macroeconomic factors. A lot of it, some of it has to do with partisanship and people's tribal affiliations here. So on this slide, we're looking at our consumer confidence data around the 2020 election. Right up until Election Day, Republicans were feeling much more confident in the economy than Democrats. Then we see confidence get kind of muddled in this Election Day to Biden's inauguration, this transition period. And then following Biden's inauguration, consumer confidence for Democrats ticks up and Republicans kind of stays in this middling position. And what that really, I think, tells me is that consumer confidence has as much to do with what's going on in the economy as it does with who's in power. So if your team's in power, you feel a little bit more confident about the economy, about your place in it, about who's in charge. No major upticks in unemployment or inflation happened over these few weeks between the Election Day and Biden's inauguration, and really the big change here was the change in power at the White House. So, as we think ahead to 2024, those trends people's relationship to the economy lags relative to other macroeconomic indicators, and partisanship is an important framing factor when it comes to how people feel about the economy. Moving on to some other issues of the day. It is award season, so we're going to kind of kick off this section with some entertainment polling we did earlier this summer, last summer rather. And, the take-home point here really is that popularity is relative. What you and your friends watch is not necessarily what another friend group in another part of the country watches. And I think that's really underscored in this question, we asked about what TV people have watched in the past year. We see some big differences when it comes to football, even when it comes to certain shows like Stranger Things or Yellowstone. So, we are living in these partisan bubbles, and our media, the media we're consuming, reinforces those narratives and those bubbles that we're living in. We're not all singing from the same songbook here by any means when it comes to the media we're consuming. And you see that from a different angle too when we look at some of the representation data that this poll asked about. So we did something interesting here. We took a series of different subgroups within the American public, so wealthy people, white-collar professionals, women, etc. And we asked Americans whether they view these people or the stories they're seeing on their screens about these different subgroups of people are negative or positive, and whether these groups of people are excluded or overexposed in the stories they're seeing on their screens. And what we found is that there isn't a lot of nuance here. People are either feeling like these different subgroups of people are shown in positive lights and overexposed, they're seeing them a lot in the media they're consuming, or they're being excluded from different media narratives and being shown in a negative light when they are shown. And, again, this really, I think, reinforces how Americans view who is in power and who is not, and how that maps on to the different partisan realities people are living in as well. So moving on, we're going back to a topic we haven't revisited in a while. With the surge in COVID cases, we're in the middle of the second biggest surge, I believe, since the pandemic began based on wastewater data. We're really not seeing people take the protective action and measures they've had in the past. People are very much over COVID and over masking and some of the other protective behaviors related to that. And this is data coming from our Ipsos consumer tracker. And I think electorally, an important thing to note here is that Biden ran and won on COVID in 2020. That was a big issue for him and for his campaign. And we're not seeing the public react to this issue in the same way. Many years have passed. People have kind of left the pandemic behind to the extent they can. And it's certainly not looking like it's going to be a big issue for his campaign. So what the issue that Biden runs on and whether people care about that issue is really going to be the big question to ask in 2024, and something Chris will touch on in a little bit. So moving on to more of an international focus here, we're looking at some polling we did with Reuters. And we asked Americans whether the U.S. should send financial aid and weapons to Ukraine and Israel. And what we found is that there's some pretty notable partisan differences here. Democrats, when we asked this question earlier this month, more Democrats felt that the U.S. should be sending financial aid and weapons to Ukraine. Slightly more Republicans felt that the U.S. should be sending more financial aid and weapons to Israel. But I think what really jumps out at me, besides the partisan differences here, is the top line numbers. Very few Americans overall feel the U.S. should be sending aid and weapons to these two allies, historic American allies. And I think that'll hold significant implications for how legislators navigate these geopolitical conflicts and how they're able to garner support domestically for them. So a space to watch as we think ahead to the new year. Now, domestically, on the state side of things, we return to the issue of abortion, something that we talk about a lot, something that's been very important for Democrats electorally in the past few election cycles. And you can really see why it's been such an important and winning issue for Democrats looking at this Reuters data from earlier this month. Democrats are really united around abortion. A decisive majority of Democrats are not satisfied with the limits they're seeing put in place around abortion in this country, while Republicans and independents are much more mixed on this question. So it really drives a wedge in abortion really drives a wedge in Republican and independent support, while it unifies Democrats, and that's why it's been such a mobilizing issue for Democratic campaigns. And whether that remains the case for this year is, again, a space we'll have to watch as the campaigns and the situation on the ground evolves. But definitely an important space to watch as we think ahead to the new year. Now, taking kind of a wider scope here, zooming out. As Chris mentioned on that slide for the Carometer up top, we're in an election year, not just in the US, but around the world, where 60 countries, 60 plus countries around the world will be going to the ballot box, comprising something in the ballpark of 4 billion people. So a lot of people are voting this year. And, in anticipation of that, we worked with some of our colleagues in other countries to ask people how satisfied they're really feeling with democracy. And what we found is that, particularly in the US and also in many other partner countries, people are feeling dissatisfied or not feeling dissatisfied with the way democracy is working in their country. Now, I do want to linger for a second on how this research was conducted. For the US, we're using our knowledge panel. This is, our go-to polling resource, high quality, gold standard that we use with the ABC News, the Washington Post, New York Times, among other top tier media partners. But we've also rolled out knowledge panels in all of these other countries as well, newly minted and a really great tool for doing some robust international research. So important thing to keep in mind as we think through all of the different elections happening all across the world this year. Taking a little bit more of a domestic look at some of the democracy questions hanging over the 2024 election. Here we're looking at some polling we did with ABC News, and we asked Americans whether they support the different cases and charges being brought against Trump. So particularly around the criminal charges being brought against Trump in the conspiring to overturn the 2020 election. A bare majority of Americans support those criminal charges. We're seeing more mixed support around the rulings in Colorado and Maine ordering that Trump not appear on the ballot as a candidate for president. So, I think the big take-home point there is that this is a really contentious issue. It really divides opinion. There's some nuances case by case, but overall, this is a really divisive and hot button issue for the public. And that holds serious implications for the trust that Americans then go on to have in the institutions litigating these cases. So when we look at how Americans feel about the Supreme Court justices ruling on these issues, a bare majority feel that the Supreme Court justices will rule based on law when it comes to Trump and the cases before the court, while 2 in 5 feel that the justice will rule based on their personal political views. So again, not a set, not unanimous trust and support in how these cases are getting litigated, and that holds serious implications for how divided, the divided partisan nature of the American political life going into this election year. So to put a little bit of a finer note on this is not super surprising information, but important to, I think, detail. So here we're looking at some polling we did with ABC News, finding that, a decisive majority of Republicans feel that Trump should remain on the ballot in all states, while more Democrats feel that Trump should be removed from the ballot, and there's a mix of Americans that feel that election officials should be deciding what's going on these different state ballots. But again, the take-home point here really is that the American public is divided politically on issues that don't necessarily touch politics very explicitly, like media representation. And when these hot-button political and contentious issues get activated in the public, those partisan tendencies and framings liven up and become even more pronounced than they already are. So again, all spaces to watch as we think ahead to 2024. And with that, I'll take it over to Chris, who will run through our election section.
Thank you, Sarah. So yeah, looking ahead to 2024, we always think it's important to start off any discussion of an election with the president's approval rating. That is really the base context for what's going on in the politics of a given country. Slide forward, please. And what we're seeing right now is that Joe Biden's approval rating continues to be stuck in this position around 40%, a little above, a little below, depending on the specific poll. This corresponds, I think, with a lot of the consumer sentiment data that Sarah was sharing earlier that has also been stuck in a very sort of middling position. And indeed, we've really seen Biden's numbers in a relatively weak state since the Delta wave of COVID happened in 2021, and particularly since inflation surged in 2022, he's really seen sort of some downward pressure on his approval ratings. And this is important because this is essentially the proxy for how popular the government is. And a popular government wins a re-election, and an unpopular government loses re-election. And what we know from looking at elections around the world that Ipsos has taken part in is that about a 40% approval rating, an incumbent president's about 50-50. It's really kind of a coin flip at this level. There is enough support for an incumbent president to win an election at this kind of approval rating, but it's definitely not a sure thing. And indeed, we really would expect Biden at 45% to be probably a favorite and at 50% to be almost a lock. And then if Biden's numbers drop down to 35%, the odds are probably in Trump's favor. So this is a very important thing to keep watching over the course of this year. Next slide. Because at what we've seen in the past for American presidents is we do see a lot of movement in their approval rating over the course of the election year. This is looking at the past 6 presidents as they run up to their first re-election. And what happened. And essentially, there are 3 cases where we sort of see typical circumstances, that is a relatively strong economy, no sort of strange black swan events. And in those cases, the incumbent president saw their approval rating gain about 7 percentage points. That would be Barack Obama in 2012, Bill Clinton in 1996, and Ronald Reagan in 1984. Gaining, a decent chunk of approval rating. However, there's also a number of instances where there have been some sort of black swan event, the COVID pandemic that came out partway through Trump's reelection campaign in 2000, George W. Bush dealing with the fallout of the Iraq War, which is becoming increasingly unpopular as he faced his reelection, and then, of course, sort of most infamously in election circles, George H.W. Bush's election, which went from essentially the high of winning the first Gulf War into a very sharp recession and a huge decline in his approval ratings over that time period. And we see even, for Trump, the COVID pandemic didn't actually depress his approval rating. He still gained 2 percentage points, despite the fact that we were seeing hundreds of thousands of Americans dying of COVID as we approached election day there. So, there is a wide range of potential outcomes for Biden for his approval rating. We think that unless there is sort of a black swan event, he is likely to see an improvement in his approval ratings, probably not 7 points like the average of we've seen over the historical time period, but probably a little bit better than the 2 points that Trump saw in his reelection effort in 2000. So, probably something in the neighborhood of 4 or 5 percentage points, which will put him into the low 40s and potentially help him have a better chance of reelection as again, we move forward to election day. But again, lots of things that we can't account for. Next slide. This is now a little bit out of date. We put this together on Monday, but it does show actually in New Hampshire, Trump had a decent lead over Haley, though not an insurmountable lead, and it actually ended up being pretty close to what happened. Polls before the election showing a 12-point advantage for Trump. I think he ended up winning with an 11-point spread, so polls pretty accurate. However, Christie, DeSantis, Ramaswamy, all much lower showings. Again, a lot of these polls were conducted before those candidates had dropped out, so they sort of had a little bit of an outsized advantage. But what this also tells us is that as we move forward to the next contest in South Carolina, Trump, who has a very large lead there, is likely to continue winning the Republican primaries. And indeed, we think that Trump, again, barring some sort of black swan event, is almost certainly going to be the Republican nominee. And even though Nikki Haley is saying she's going to stay in the race, her odds of winning, at least based on delegates, are pretty low. Next slide. So then let's And one of the reasons we believe that to be the case is because Donald Trump is actually the most popular figure in the Republican Party. We see 2/3 of Republican likely primary voters say that they're considering voting for him better than any other Republican candidate. So even though Trump has oftentimes been around 50% in the polls, that's not to suggest that there's some magical 50% of Republicans who are opposed to him. Indeed, a clear majority of Republicans are okay with his being the Republican standard bearer, which is why he's enjoyed sort of this dominant position throughout. Next. So then turning to, one more slide on this before we turn to the general election. And one of the reasons Trump has remained so stable despite the number of challenges, particularly legal challenges he's faced over the last year, is because Republicans do not really believe the legal challenges to be valid or justified. Instead, they believe they are politically motivated. Essentially, it is efforts by Trump's political opponents to discredit him, not legitimate charges against him. And as a consequence, we see very little impact on Republicans' views of Trump's electability. Indeed, only about 15% of Republicans believe that these charges or efforts to remove Trump from ballots due to the 14th Amendment, the insurgency clause, make Trump less likely to win. So, we're not seeing the court challenges to Trump having a real impact with him and his base. Next slide. But as we move forward to the general election, we're seeing a little bit of a different picture. And indeed, as we ask people what if their vote matters, we actually see Biden's base of voters a little bit more positive about their vote mattering, having a difference on the election outcome than Trump. Part of that could be Trump voters believing that the 2020 election was stolen from Trump, but still it does suggest that the enthusiasm gap that has been made of in recent months may not necessarily be quite as pronounced as a lot of people have made out. And indeed, as we start to have a more clear competition of Trump versus Biden, we may see some of the numbers in the horse race polling equalize a little bit as this sort of enthusiasm thing plays out. Next slide. The other thing that is very important to keep in mind as we head towards the general election, aside from Biden's approval ratings, which I mentioned before, is what the main issue is facing the country, what Americans are prioritizing as their main issue. This is from our polling with Reuters. It's a different way of asking it, where we ask about each one, how important it is to affect their vote. And you can see that there's, of course, a lot of issues that Americans are saying important. The economy and crime, as we saw on our main issue slide from Core Political, are some of the top issues. We see other things like the income inequality, politicization of law enforcement, elites interfering with your freedom, also coming up as relatively important issues. But when you break this out by Republicans and Democrats, you actually see a really different rank order. And I think this speaks to some of the idiosyncrasies we've seen in recent elections. So for instance, if you look at protecting abortion access in your state or government efforts to fight climate change, among Democrats, those are high priority items. Indeed, they're tied with the economy, if not slightly ahead of the economy, as important to determining people's votes. So even though as a main issue facing the country, they're relatively further down the list, for Democrats, for the election, they're very important. And this is part of what's driving the Democratic overperformance in some special elections over the last 2 years. On the other side, we see for Republicans, immigration and then sort of anti-elite policies have an outsized importance. And I think that sort of speaks to the things that on the Republican side of the ledger have been very important. So as we watch the election, this is where we're going to see candidates talking to their base. Republicans are going to be talking to their base about anti-elite policies, about immigration issues. Democrats are going to be talking to their base about abortion or climate change. Both sides are going to be talking about the economy and crime. And the real sort of key question is which one of these sides ends up having the most persuasive argument. Next slide. And right now, Donald Trump actually seems to have a more persuasive argument on some of the main issues, the top tier issues. In the red box, you see the economy and crime, and we see Donald Trump has about a 9 percentage point advantage over Joe Biden on those issues. However, there is a large chunk, a little over a quarter up to a third of Americans who say they don't know. And that essentially reflects Donald Trump's fundamental strength right now on the key issues facing the country. However, again, with these issues that are more niche or more sort of focused on sort of the base, we see Joe Biden actually has a over 20 point lead on climate change or abortion relative to Trump. And Trump has a 10 to 15 point lead on anti-elite or immigration issues over Biden. So you can see, again, there's this real competition on sort of the issue landscape, and which of these issues dominates the debate will be important to understanding how the election is going to unfold. If the debate becomes more culture war focused, which ironically is what conservative media likes to talk about more, that's actually better for Biden because he actually is seen as stronger in a lot of those issues. If instead the debate stays on sort of crime or immigration issues, that'll be probably more hospitable for Trump. And for the economy, I think this is one of the ones where the data Sarah shared about sort of consumer sentiment is going to be important, because does consumer sentiment improve? Do people start to give Biden more credit for the economy? Do these numbers sort of come a little bit more of a break-even place? Or does Trump continue to have an advantage on the economy, in which case I think he's probably in the stronger position for an electoral victory in November. One other thing to note, though, is there are a couple of places where Trump actually underperforms the generic Republican. So we can see we have Biden versus Trump and then Democrats minus Republican, more of a generic. And we can see on the economy and on crime, Trump actually underperforms generic Republicans. And indeed, we saw this play out in the midterm elections last year, where sort of more typical Republicans actually perform better than Trump-endorsed MAGA Republicans in a number of key elections. Next slide. So looking at the ballot, right now we see a ballot, a horse race that is really closely divided, 35% Trump, 35% Biden, about 30% saying that they wouldn't vote, or they'd vote third party, or they don't know. This, to me, reflects an electorate that is very unsettled. This is among all Americans now. Remember, I'll come back to that in a moment. But a substantial number of Americans who really don't have a preference right now, and only a third of Americans who are behind one or the other of the major candidates. This, to me, suggests that there's a lot of instability. There's a lot of potential movement in what's going to happen in the election, because there's a lot of people who are out there who are not super happy with their choices. And indeed, that's what we see when we add a third-party candidate, Robert Kennedy Jr. in this case, in a substantial number of Americans saying that they'd support that third-party candidate, with some decline in Biden and Trump's support. Again, I think really is a testament to sort of people's unhappiness with the two major parties. I don't expect Kennedy would approach anything like 18% come election day. I think a lot of this is being driven by people who are probably not going to end up voting. But I think at this point in time, it is a great illustration of discontent that exists out in the public right now. And I think that's a very important sub-thread that's to keep in mind, is that the public is very unhappy, very discontented, not thrilled with their choices, and that was going to add further instability to the election. Next slide. Another thing to keep an eye on, and this is of course a little bit more detailed, is how some of these subpopulations are behaving in the election as we move forward. So this is, again, that same two-way horse race data among all Americans, but broken out by different subgroups. You can see Republicans and Democrats are very united around their guys, almost exact mirror images there, with Trump doing a little bit better among independents right now than Biden, though most independents saying that they would not vote or they haven't made up their mind. And this is one of the key differences from 2020, where Biden actually performed a little bit better among independents than Trump did. So that's really some of the key movement that we're seeing. Likewise, for right now, for Biden particularly, some of his problems is that he is struggling to secure support from minority voters who have traditionally been Democratic voters. We see a large number of Black or African American voters saying that they don't know or have no preference right now. Relatively large number of Hispanic voters as well, saying that they don't have a clear idea now, even as Biden continues to win both of those blocks. And then going down to the bottom row, I think it's an interesting phenomenon that younger voters, Gen Z voters, are currently pretty close to split between Trump and Biden, with a substantial number, 42%, saying that they don't know or would not vote. Now, young people are always vote at lower rates than older younger Americans, but I think this relatively even split is something of a newer phenomenon. Young people have traditionally been a bit of an advantage for Democrats, and I think this is partially a testament to what's happening in the economy. The poor economy has a bigger impact on people just starting in their career, which are younger people. I think younger people also have sort of a greater amount of disillusion with the establishment. Indeed, if you look at the numbers, Trump's number isn't actually any better with younger voters than it is with older voters. Indeed, 28% is actually slightly lower, but Biden is also weaker with those younger voters. I think that's sort of a key challenge is Biden needs to figure out a way, if he's going to win re-election, to appeal to Gen Z voters and convince them that he's worth supporting. And indeed, we had some polling that we did for a client of ours, the Public Religion Research Institute, yesterday, where Gen Z Americans' number one message was that they think there needs to be a change in leadership, a generational change in leadership of America. So that's going to be a hard sell for Biden, who is 80 years old, to make that case to younger Americans as we move forward. Next slide. So that's it. Please, if you have any questions, use that Q&A field. We have a little bit of time that we can go through and answer some of them. So let's see what we got. First question, do we have a point of view on who's going to win or who the Republicans are going to pick for vice president? Sarah, do you want to take that one, the vice president pick? Always popular.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that's been a very buzzy question over the past few days and one we've been talking about in our own group chats at work. But just speculation here, total that's just talking from my own perspective. It looks like maybe Tim Scott, that's some of the buzz we're seeing. But I don't know, Chris, do you have any perspective there?
I think Scott is a strong choice, probably where the betting market is. I think Elise Stefanik, Republican House member from New York, one of the ranking members, is also kind of buzzy and has been very loud in her support for Trump. So I think those are two possible ones. But Trump is, he's going to pick someone who he thinks is going to be very loyal to him. So I think there's a lot of potential people on that list. Next question, what do we think is driving the significant difference for Swedes? I assume that's on the support for democracy question that Sarah showed earlier. It's actually something that we talked about when we did that research, and our colleagues in Sweden we're a little surprised at how positive it was there, but there is, I think, in the Nordic countries, the Scandinavian countries, there have been more sort of general positive feelings about the functioning of government. They're essentially less disgruntled than particularly like the United States and the United Kingdom or France have been in recent years. So I think that's part of it, but also maybe it's a little bit of just general positivity. Let's see, next question. On the Biden approval chart, there's a point where Biden's approval, disapproval flips. Do you know what happened during that time? Yeah, so there's two things that happened at that time. One was the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is what the press typically focuses on as what caused Biden's drop. But I think my theory has always been it was actually the Delta wave of COVID, which actually drew it, which happened at the same time. Now, if you can remember all the way back then, COVID happened, the pandemic happened, we were all terrified, we were locking down, we started to slowly reemerge, but we're still kind of terrified through the course of 2020. And at the end of 2020, the vaccine rolled out. Too late to help Trump, and then he sort of, had his weird sort of anti-vax position, so he wasn't really ever able to claim credit for it anyways. But by early 2021, the vaccine had rolled out, started to reach large numbers of Americans. COVID rates had dropped pretty fast, and we were all in this moment of thinking that we were all going to get back to our lives. There was a bunch of government money in the economy sort of slushing around, so people felt flush. And there's this sort of summer of good vibes, right? There's that hot vaxxed summer, if you can remember that far back in 2021. But then the Delta wave happened. The COVID vaccines appeared not to protect us from it as well as we had thought or hoped. So all of a sudden, all of the COVID anxiety came back. And it happened the same time as Afghanistan, as our withdrawal from Afghanistan. But I think that COVID anxiety, which was originally Joe Biden's fundamental message, right, was that he was the one who was going to better handle the pandemic, undercut his positioning on that issue because the vaccine didn't end up solving it the same way, and we had to struggle on with COVID for a number of years. And indeed, we're right now in the midst, as Sarah said, of the second highest number of COVID cases ever, though the lethality of the disease seems to certainly have waned a lot. And that, I think, really is what destroyed Biden's approval ratings early on in his presidency. And then it's been a series of things after that, most notably, of course, inflation, which, gas prices have been pretty high. They're coming down now, but it's been one thing after another. Gas prices, egg prices, milk, housing prices is actually the piece of the inflationary index that's actually still kind of high at the moment. So it's been one thing after another, and I think it's the key question for this year is there yet another shoe that drops that keeps Biden's approval rating depressed, or does he finally start to see some recovery because things sort of are getting back to normal? We'll have to wait and see. Can you clarify why you feel President Biden will improve his favorability over the next year, given his weakness on the most important issues, the economy, crime, and immigration? That view is really based on what we're seeing in sort of macroeconomic data, that essentially the economy is doing well, that inflation is coming down, that jobs remain the jobs numbers remain solid, GDP growth remains solid, and the view that public opinion about the economy tends to be a lagging indicator behind those. And indeed, that's what we saw in 2012 with Barack Obama's re-election. Remember, Barack Obama took office in pretty bad economic times in the Great Recession. Economic recovery was relatively slow the first couple of years of his presidency. The Democrats got destroyed in 2010 in the midterms, but by 2012, the economy was growing at a pretty decent clip. And we did see Obama, when he went out on the campaign track, backed by a growing economy, his approval ratings improved pretty substantially over that time period. So we are expecting Biden to be able to benefit from something similar, probably not to the same level that Obama did, but we are expecting him to be able to benefit from that, unless, of course, the economy goes down again, which we can't predict necessarily. No one is really super great at predicting recessions, but that is one of the events to watch for is, does the economy continue to strengthen? Does it go back? If the economy turns back negative, I think that means Donald Trump is likely to win. I heard that 40% of Americans identify as independent. That stat is hard to believe. Can you comment on it? It also seems like from prior slide, independents lean Trump. Sarah, you want to take the number of independents thing?
Sure. Yeah, it is an important point to think about in our partisan reality that 2 in 5 independents, when we ask independents and look at independent public opinion and break it down by different policy issues or behaviors, we see that independents tend to lean one way or the other. And you can regroup independents into there are different partisan leanings based on that. So there are certain partisan preferences within the independent group. And, I think that also really speaks that higher rates of independent identification really speaks to the disillusionment many Americans feel with the two-party system and their choices in our political system. So, I totally understand how that can be hard to conceptualize given how often we talk about partisanship and Democrats versus Republicans, but it is a good point to remind people that independents make up a large part of the electorate and the American populace, and that they're really a reflection of, I think, the dissatisfaction many Americans feel with the political parties at play.
Yeah, I think that, 40% number that the question had is right in a lot of polls, but that 40% actually represents a number of people who, walk like Republicans, talk like Republicans, but sort of dislike Republicans, and walk like Democrats and talk like Democrats, but dislike the Democratic Party. So, it depends on sort of how you're classifying it. But I think one thing that is true is that the popularity of both the Democratic and Republican parties are at pretty all-time lows, as Sarah was saying. Next question. In the past few days, we've heard a lot of buzz about how the Vibe session has turned into a Vibe expansion. Actually, I hadn't heard Vibe expansion yet. When will your polling reflect that change, and will that help Biden, or is it too late? Sarah, you want to take that one? The vibes?
The vibes. I feel like we first started talking about the vibes during the Delta wave and during that summer that Chris was mentioning. And yeah, I mean, I think this is something that is a kind of nebulous concept to systematize in our polling and in our research, but it is something that we're trying to do when we're looking at our economic confidence and we're looking at how people are feeling about the issue landscape, and people are feeling still kind of lukewarm about that. I think that's really what's coming through in all of our data. So to the extent that the vibes continue to be off, and whether that holds through for the rest of the year for Biden and his campaign, I think it's, again, something we can't predict. No vibe predictions over here. But something we'll definitely make sure to track.
Yeah, and like the consumer confidence data that Sarah shared with you from January, is up a little bit. It's not up a lot, it's up a little bit. And the University of Michigan consumer confidence study, which came out last week, that is driving a lot of this Vibe expansion coverage, I think it might be a little bit of an outlier on their own poll. I think they probably have a little bit of noise happening, and it's just sort of happening in a direction people want to tell a story. But yeah, it is, I think, definitely the thing to watch, and particularly over the next 3 to 5 months, the thing to watch to really sort of decide, because I don't think it's too late for Biden. I think, if things are like they are today in September, it would be too late for Biden. But I think there's a lot of time yet for things to change. So definitely something to watch, and to see if the Vibe expansion continues, or if we go back to a Vibe session or an actual recession, which some economists are still predicting could happen this year. Those are all the questions I see. So unless anyone else has something they'd like to send in, thank you for your time today. We really appreciate it. I think we'll be back with our next webinar in February. Ellen, I don't remember when that was scheduled, but thank you everyone for joining us.
February 28th.
February 28th for the next Inside Track. So thank you for joining us. Again, all of this data is available on our website, and this presentation will be sent out to you in the next few days. Have a great week. Take care.